Did you play any sports growing up?
I did. I started. I was from a pretty small town, so the only sport we had really was baseball.
Yeah.
And so I played baseball, and then we moved to a little bit of a larger town, and I actually studied abroad in England. So I learned how to play soccer and rugby. And then I came back, I played more soccer, and then picked up rugby later in high school and played rugby through college, and then soccer again afterwards. So.
Okay. Would you say that kind of drew you to sport management, or did something else drew you to the
A
field?
little of that. I love the idea of sport. I was actually drawn into sport management from the perspective of its connections with the community, which is why I exclusively worked in baseball initially, was because with the minor league teams, it was much more connected to the smaller towns and the communities and the
It's like a big
history.
part of their community. Yes.
Exactly, and then there was the sort of the socialization process of parents and kids playing baseball, and we get that with soccer now. I think growing more than it used to be baseball, now it's more soccer.
Yeah.
So those connections were really what drew me into sport. So.
Okay. What kind of research are you doing or have you done related to sport management or the sporting field?
Yeah, most of my sport research has been focused on predominantly related to sport participation and the health outcomes associated with that, or developmental outcomes associated with that. I did some research early looking at the organizational processes of NASCAR and sort of and that actually stemmed from my interest in communities, and particularly it's actually what was spurred to do that when the North Wilkesboro Speedway closed down in the western part of the state, and so that community
I've seen that one before.
lost its major league sporting venue, and just was interested in sort of that effect, and so that was another project that I worked on early in my career, and then now I've actually been focused more on this concept of sport for development, which is looking at NGOs, particularly in right now in sub-Saharan Africa, but also potentially how this model could be used in, say, rural North Carolina to use sport for the greater good kind of thing, that we can take youth and sort of teach them, like in Africa, about HIV/AIDS awareness, about nutrition, about
so it's more health focused then.
Okay. Health and sort of finding those
make sure it's still going. Okay. Whoops. I can do I have to do that? Okay, we'll be good.
Just finding those sort of other benefits of sport that it can sort of link with the community side of things. So.
Okay. What would you say this research has shown you about the sports and recreation field? Has it shown you any new things or anything?
Well, I think it really I think it's showing me that sport in of itself has no good or bad. Like I mean, it's how it's managed. I mean, I think that's the biggest thing, is how the organization uses sport, how sport is leveraged really matters. And so if you manage sport for these positive outcomes and really focus on the good, then sport can be very good. However, if you're focused on sport as, in some cases, as an entertainment vehicle, as sport as a means for financial gain, then your priorities get changed, and sport may not be, you're willing to accept certain bad things in sport. And I look like the NFL, for example, and issues with concussions and CTE and things like this, which comes from a profit motive and entertainment motive that have been willing to accept certain risks and lack
just for money or for other things.
So I think it really comes the importance of the organization, how it's managed, really matters in terms of the potential benefits of sport. The sport in itself doesn't lead to positive outcomes. It has to be managed intentionally to do so.
Right. How have you seen the sporting industry grow over the years, and what do you think have been some of the reasons for the growth?
Yeah, I do. I think a couple of things have happened. I think we've gotten a lot more diverse in our interest in sports. So when I was growing up, I mean, particularly in the U.S., it was football, baseball, basketball.
Like the generic sports.
Yeah, and very, very narrow, and that's what we're shown. I think that we're seeing a much more diverse portfolio of sports, of kids playing sport, of watching sport, of sort of competitive and non-competitive, focused into this. We're seeing a lot more of that. The biggest change, and I think the most positive change we've seen is girls and women sport.
Right.
I think we've seen an absolutely seismic change in the role of sport in girls and women, and most of that has come from Title IX. That was the impetus, but globally we're seeing sport as being such a phenomenal means of sort of empowering girls and women, and sort of the acceptance of girls and women's sport as being mainstream now, and I think that where you parents were not necessarily pushing daughters into playing sport 20 years ago, you're seeing much more equitable focus on sport for girls and women now, and that's probably, I would say, that the biggest change that I've seen in sport even in the last 10 years in terms of
just
sort of
the women that are doing it now, I guess.
Yeah.
That kind of leads to my next question. What all have you seen with like social inequality within the sports world? And I guess you can like highlight the women or any other things.
Well, I think globally you still see women are there's a gap between boys and girls and the men's and women's participation in sport. I think that gap is closing. Right. I still think there's a massive gap in terms of socioeconomic class. Even the women that are participating in sport predominantly come from higher social class. I think if you look at globally, it's there, and particularly nationally, there is a gap in terms of who plays sport, who doesn't, based on socioeconomic status. I mean, simply having the time to because most of the sport is delivered in the private sector in the schools. That private sector sport requires registration fees,
coaching fees. It's a lot more expensive.
It does, and then you get in the schools, and the schools are very focused on elite athletics. So in the U.S., we see less of this outside of the U.S., where school sport is mostly sport for all. It's designed to get every kid playing sport. And the U.S. is really, especially when you get in middle school and high school, it's really focused
more like
on
the professional, preparing you for
playing on the varsity team, and so those kids that don't make the team don't have a place to play. And we see community sport dropping off at that age as well, and so it becomes a real issue. And that sport at the schools, you've got to be able to practice every day. So if you have to get an outside job, or you've got child care and responsibilities back at home because if parents have to work 2 jobs, then it's harder and harder to play sport in that way. And then so I do see that gap. We still have a problem with, I think in the States, more so than anywhere else, having inclusive sport. So sport for
disabled.
Exactly. Other countries do a much better job of providing adapted sport and inclusive sport for kids and adults with disabilities. And that's something I think we need to do as well.
All right. So if I'm looking to go into the sport management field, what are some tips I need to know? Or do you have any tips?
Yeah, I mean, a little bit. I think be broad in terms of your interpretation of sport. We see a lot of students who want to go work in for professional teams, and it's a very narrow area. 75% of all sport consumption in the United States is in participation sport. I mean, it's very much about working in public parks and recreation, and working in nonprofits, and working with sort of places to get people playing sport rather than watching sport. And so I think a lot of the what excites me about sport is that we're doing sport for good in that way.
Yeah, you're getting people active and different things.
I think that the big thing about sport is that it's very competitive in terms of getting into the field. And so anything you can do to demonstrate your work ethic, demonstrate your ability to communicate, to I use this term loosely, to sell. Not just
sell yourself, kind of.
And to be willing to network and be outgoing and things like that. That's going to those are the types of characteristics that are going to work in any kind of sport job. So I think that those are always good skills to develop, regardless of what field you're going into.
Okay. Would you say that the field of sport management is a growing field? Or?
Yeah, I think it's definitely growing. I mean, and especially as our interpretation of sport continues to broaden. So, I mean, there's activities that 20 years ago you wouldn't consider sports. So like thinking about like the X Games and the
now it's more like extreme sports kind of.
Yeah, and even like I just had this conversation earlier about Quidditch. So if Quidditch from Harry Potter is now developed into a IRL sport. And so you've got Quidditch teams forming on campuses. I mean, it's just going to be a matter of time before
when
that's
like an actual sport.
exactly.
Maybe.
And so thinking about how sport is growing in that way, the sporting goods industry, sports being developed in terms of community programs and nonprofit sport. I mean, there's just so many places now that and particularly with the obesity and inactivity sort of crisis that's now top of mind. There's new opportunities, I think, for folks to get involved with sport with the goal of getting people playing sport.
Yeah. Okay. What would you say are some of the difficulties that you have encountered by being in the sport management field, or have you encountered any difficulties?
I mean, I think there's. I mean, it's typically I've worked in the private sector where you're dealing with a consumer product, so always trying to compete with other places where people can spend their money, and to stand out in that way can be a challenge. I do think that there are. And I think this is the way it is with any kind of leisure services sort of profession is that you do have to build your credibility. I mean, people think, oh, you're in sport management, you're in recreation management.
Yeah.
What do? You must just play all the time.
Yeah.
And things like that. And I think there's some misconceptions about how much work goes into providing
the play for those people.
Exactly. And so I think once you sort of explain to people, first of all, I was saying, tell me about the things you do in your leisure. What do you like to do? What kind of sports you do? And they start realizing how important that is to their lives. Then they realize, wait, I'm really glad I've got somebody that's sort of delivering it in a way that.
Because some people kind of downplay the degree, and then I'm like, like if you didn't have us to provide this, then where would you get that from?
Right, exactly. So I think that trying to sort of fight that misconception sometimes can be a challenge, but I think that people when they sort of understand it, really understand how important it is. I think the the reason why I'm here and not still working in sport, though, I think is the lifestyle can be hard. I mean, it's a lot of hours. It's
not really like a family life.
No, it's not. Right. And it's it's also you've got to be mobile. I mean, there opportunities pop up all the time. You've got to be able to move, and if you want to move up an organization, sometimes you got to move somewhere else, and so it requires you to. The permanence isn't always there. So I think it at times I feel like that it's not always a field to grow old in, unfortunately. Right. But a lot of people do it very well.
Yeah. So in my sport management class, my target job is the manager of youth services. Have you ever worked with youth before in sports?
I have. So I worked not necessarily in sports directly. I've had some camps that were put on through my organization, and so my coaches worked with them. I've worked sort of consulting with youth sport organizations. I'm working right now with an NGO in sub-Saharan Africa that is working with a lot of youth in the area. So I'm working on their evaluation, things like that. To me, this gets me excited about. I mean, I have a student who did an internship with Castle, with the Capital Area Soccer League, and she did a really nice job, and they developed a full-time position for her. I think those types of organizations are doing really exciting stuff and sort of setting the groundwork for really healthy lifestyles and for kids and getting them excited about sport. And I think that it's a really growing area. And I get excited about people who want to work with youth sport, because I think that in the States, when I go do my work in England and other places where they've really been intentionally focused on youth sport as part of the system, where you've got to be a licensed coach to coach youth. Here in the States, we've been very ad hoc about it for the longest time, where any dad who can hold a clipboard is allowed to coach.
Right.
Which, I'm one of those as well. But developing training programs, implementing youth development principles into the way we deliver sport, things like that are only going to make positive change. So having individuals with that youth development background, management background, now working in youth sports, I think is going to make our sport industry a lot stronger than the way it's kind of been in the past. So.
Yeah. So this question is kind of like one that I asked earlier, but if you were hiring a sport management student, what are the one qualities you would look for? Or the top, I'll say top 3 qualities.
Yeah, top 3 qualities. Obviously, someone who is hardworking and has really good critical thinking skills, because I want someone who can not just have me tell them what to do, but identify the problem and come up with their own solutions to those things. And then kind of a third would be really conscientious, somebody who fits well, because you have to work with a team. You usually work a lot of long hours. You've got to work together, and you've got to deal with everything from irate customers to irate parents, irate coaches. I mean, the people you're dealing with, you've got to be able to keep your cool and manage those problems. And I always tell my staff that, remember, this is the 20th time you've heard somebody complain about this, but for that individual, that's the first time they've complained about
so
it.
you have to stay on your A game, no matter.
And so you can't treat them as if they're the 20th person who's complained about this, because that's not going to help. So I think having those three skills. Now, the sort of the unwritten rule that I would say is I really always wanted some people who didn't necessarily want to work in sports. I think we always get a lot of people who want to work in sports because they're big sports fans or love sports, and they're so focused on the sports side of it, they don't recognize what I call the sport enterprise, the whole the business side and all this kind of stuff. And so it's always those individuals who really they like the sport, but really they were there to make to make the operations better, and the sport was just tangential to that. Those are always people I like. So it's not that people who love sport can't do well. It's just you've got to recognize that you're not there to be a fan, not there
you have to be the kind of the backstage people.
Exactly.
Because the people who just love sports, that's nice, but they have to know that.
Yeah, one of my questions that I used to ask the students would always ask me for recommendations, job recommendations, and I would always sit them down and say, all right, tell me why you want to work in sports. And if their response was, well, I love sports. I watch ESPN all the time. I'm a big fan. I'm like, well, great. Go work in a bank and go buy a season ticket. And you can be a sports fan all you want. But if you got to recognize you're not going to see any of the game. You're going to be in the background. You're going to be doing this kind of stuff. So that's just one of
that's a good way to look at it. So what led you to become an associate professor within this curriculum, which is Parks and Recreation / Sport Management?
Yeah, so I mean, in reality, the whole thing is actually interesting. So I've been working in baseball for 10 years, and it was getting burned out. We just built a brand new stadium up in the Cleveland area, and this is before we had kids, and so my wife and I were just trying to figure out, what's our next steps. And I'd actually been offered the general manager position in Kinston with the Kinston Indians at the time, and then I decided, that I could keep going down that path or do something different, and we decided that I wanted to get out of baseball, but I had this experience. I didn't want to just throw a lot of my colleagues that left just went into a completely different field, and I felt that I had this experience. How can I use it in a way? And so I'd been hiring interns over the years and really enjoyed working with those students and developing real structured internship programs, things like that. And so I said, and I'd given a lot of guest lectures in classes, and so let's try this. And so I went back to graduate school at that point, and what I found was where I really had gone in to go teach, I really loved the research. And then so I did my PhD here at NC State. And I started to shift from this focus on the sport management that I had done, focused on sort of spectator sports, and really started getting into the recreation side, participation side. I then got a position at Texas A&M University in youth development. So I didn't have a big youth development background, and this was outside of the sport. And so this actually, I think, really helped to round out my philosophy related to sport with this focus on youth development. We focus more on the recreation side. So now coming back to sport, I really have a much broader perspective that I teach from, as well as my research is, and I still links back to sport a bit in my research, but in terms of my teaching, I can really present both. I have the credibility to teach from the perspective of the managing the sport organization, but also a broader kind of philosophy on sort of what sport should look like. And
was the youth development, was that a degree program at Texas A&M?
It was. So it was in the Recreation Park Tourism Sciences. It was a concentration of youth development. We had youth undergraduate, master's, and PhD programs, and so really focused on I would say most of our students worked for like the Boys and Girls Club,
sounds kind of interesting to me.
And camps. So I taught essentially like Dr. Baccaro's class, but focused more on nonprofit youth organizations, and I developed a camp administration class, and So there's a lot of cool
Wow.
stuff that was in there. We actually taught we developed, which is something you could do at Texas A&M, but not many places. We developed a faith and recreation class. So a lot of our students wanted to go
yeah.
into faith-based organizations.
Yeah.
So,
Oh, that's interesting.
yeah.
So have you ever worked with any type of professional sports teams? Which I think you already mentioned that, but yeah.
Yeah, so most of my career was in professional baseball. I worked. I started my career with the Carolina Mudcats, working in game day operations. I was then I did an internship in Burlington in the Appalachian League, and then another internship in Mobile, and then
Alabama.
Yep.
Yeah.
And then I was a director of operations for a team in Meridian, Mississippi. And I came back to Burlington as assistant GM, was promoted to GM, general manager the next year. Was there for 4 years. Was in Columbus, Georgia as the general manager, vice president. I was a vice president, general manager of a team outside of Cleveland. Most of this was the Indians organization. Yeah. And then when I came back to grad school, I ran the Wilson Tobbs of the Coastal Plain League for a few years. In addition to that, I also consulted with an American Basketball Association team, with a hockey team, and I did a marketing consultancy with a NASCAR Busch Series team. So,
nice.
So I've got
a lot of different.
I do have quite a bit of professional sport background.
Yeah. Let's see. Would you agree that the sport industry is more about who you know than what you know? Because we kind of talked about that, like the networking aspect in our class. So, how do you feel about that?
I think it's both. I think there's a balance there. I think that the networking side is phenomenal to get your foot in the door or to learn about opportunities. I think once you use that and leverage that, you've got to do a good job. I mean, because just as much as who you know, it's who knows you. And so if you can use those contacts and networks to find out what opportunities, to get your foot in the door, etc. But then you don't follow up on that. You're lazy. You're not very competent. You can't sort of think outside the box. You're not a good colleague. That reputation follows those same networks. And so if once you use that to your advantage, you've got to keep that advantage and demonstrate that you're worthy of that. Because I think I find that there's a small percentage of individuals who can get jobs and successfully get jobs regardless of how well they do them because of who they know. I think for the majority of us, those networks are really, really helpful. But if you don't perform,
right, you might get it, but once you get in there and you don't have the skills, then you might.
And sport is a very small sort of. I mean, the folks that are working in it, it's kind of a small community, and particularly within regions. So if you're really interested in working in North Carolina or something like that, then a lot of people, they know each other, and so they
tell them,
and they trust each other, and so they're not going to like give someone a good recommendation who hasn't done a good job, or they're going to know if you're really have the potential or not. And so you have to be careful. You can't rely on just making contacts and still not performing. That's not going to substitute. So
so what are some good ideas of possible internships for someone who's in the sport management field? I would say dealing with youth.
Yeah, right.
That's more my focus.
Sure. So I would say that there's quite a bit. I mean, certainly there are places like Castle, the Capital Area Soccer League, probably other sort of soccer programs like that. There are a lot of the professional teams that would likely have an internship focused on community relations. So working with some of the youth programs, going out and bringing in little league teams, things like that. The Hurricanes as well, like work with youth hockey programs, etc. I think that a lot of the nonprofits like the YMCA are going to have youth sport programs and looking for interns. I know that Raleigh Parks and Recreation has
they have a lot of internships.
They do, and some that are working in athletics focused on it. I had a student that was working solely on the youth sport programs as his internship last year. So those are, I think there are opportunities in all the sectors to find one, but to me it's about finding that. To me, the internship is finding, is this really what I want to do or not? And so I always recommend finding a really small organization that you can do a lot of things in. So
to get to know all different sides of the
exactly,
field.
and so I find that sometimes in the a lot of students are drawn to like working in these big organizations and really specializing early, but that gives you a very narrow glimpse. If you can find a small organization where you've got more responsibility, it's a lot harder work, but you get to understand everything about it. And not only does it position you for, I think, for an entry-level position somewhere, because now you can do about anything, but also you understand the dimensions of the organization that, this really isn't for me, this is really where I want to go. So it really gives you that exposure to that, which is what a good internship should do, right?
Yeah. It should let you see all different sides of whatever job it is.
And I had a student that worked up at in Virginia Beach at the sport, I forget what the name of it, Sportsplex or something like that. It's a really big indoor soccer, cheerleading, basketball kind of events place. It's a commercial operation, but it really runs as a community center.
Yeah.
But in her internship, she had to do like a week in accounting, a week in sales, a weekend. So they really rotated them around. And before she even started her specialization, but they wanted them to know every aspect of the organization. I think that was
really helpful.
And those are the kind of things that as you look at internships that we're really trying to push our students to do to sort of ask those questions about what you're going to get to do. And I mean, so as you know.
Yes,
so.
for sure. Is there any other things you would want to say about the sport management field, or any, I guess, future tips or anything?
Yeah, again, I used to tell, interns and students, you need to go with your eyes wide open, because it's not a field that's for everybody. It's a lot of work, and you're going to be asked to do a lot of things that that everybody should be doing, but not everybody expects to be doing, particularly with a college degree and everything else. But everybody has to sort of pull their weight and
you
pitch in.
Start at the bottom sometimes.
It is, and a lot of things. Like for my sport finance class, we'll have the director of finance coming in from Castle. She's an accountant. I mean, she's a finance person, but she'll tell you when they have a big tournament coming in, it's all hands on deck, and she's out manning a concession stand or parking cars or that, and that's. It's not as glamorous as we think sometimes in sports, nor should it be.
Some people are just like, oh, sports, it's going to be so fun and everything, and then you're doing kind of the dirty work, I guess.
Exactly. I was scrubbing toilets, my first, because somebody had to scrub the toilets to get them ready for games and things like that. And so, so that's the things you're going to have to do. And so
I guess that humbles you, though.
It does, but I think you have to go with eyes wide open in terms of what it's like working in sports. It's not the glamour job. It never pays as well as some places.
Right.
And so you get caught up in thinking sport and thinking about these big player contracts and things like that. But the fact of the matter is, when I had a position open in one of my teams I worked for, I would have 200 resumes trying to fill that position. There's so many people that want to get their foot in the door in sport, and it's a supply and demand situation. So you can pay less because there's so many people wanting to work in sports. So, so you have to really,
There's the good and the bad, I guess you have to take with it.
It is. There is, and so, but it can be a lot of fun. So it's just recognizing your eyes wide open. So.
Well, thank you very much.
Hopefully that helps.
Good interview.